Hello and welcome to the World Wanderers podcast, a proud part of the Wander Barn Podcast Network.
I'm Ryan.
I'm Amanda.
And we're your hosts.
We're a traveling couple and digital nomads taking you on our adventures as we explore locations, destinations, and careers.
Enjoy the show.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the World Wanderers podcast. As always, we are super grateful and excited that you've decided to tune in to today's episode of the show. And we've got a fun episode today on a topic that we've never really covered in length on the podcast. And it's around the different methods of travel within Mexico. But we wanted to kick off this episode by just talking about, a couple of reasons why we love Mexico and give a little bit of background as to why this is something we're talking about. Because you might be thinking like, okay, well, I don't really care about bus companies or airline companies in Mexico. But if you do decide to travel here, it actually will become a big part of your planning.
Yeah, I think this is one of the biggest things when we know people who are coming and planning to spend time in Mexico is how do you actually go about getting around the country? So for us, over the years here, we've been able to try out basically every means of transportation through Mexico. And one of the things we love about the country is just there's so much to see and to do. It's not just one city, one resort, one beach. There's so much to do. And so one of the great things and one of the things we recommend when people come here is get to different places, start here, go there. And so if you're thinking about taking, a longer trip, especially, working and traveling or whatever, you need to start thinking about what are the different ways you want to get around a place. And so that's kind of where we come from here, because lots of people are asking questions of what are the best ways to get around? Is busing safe, et cetera, et cetera. So wanted to dive in from there.
Yeah, for sure. This episode was actually kind of inspired by a friend of ours who's going to be coming to Mexico in May, so in a couple of months. And her and I went back and forth a lot, just she's like, hey, this is my itinerary. I'm going from here to here and then here to here. Would it be better to take a flight here, to bus here? What's the best way to get from this point to this point? And even we've had other friends who know Mexico quite well say, hey, I'm flying into this airport. Do I take a bus? What company do I go with? Do I rent a driver? How much does it cost? Is it worth it? And so, like Ryan said, Mexico is a fantastic place for a 1 week beach vacation, but it's also a great place for a 3 week kind of backpacking trip or a 2 week road trip, or to come for a couple of months and spend a great amount of time in a couple of different cities, or to even, like we've done over the past, base yourself in one city and then do travels from there. And I think one of the reasons that we've continued to come back to Mexico, moved to Mexico, called Mexico home, is just because there are a lot of things to see and do in this country. And we've explored a ton. And I still feel like we both have an extensive bucket list, because there's just a ton to see and do here. So it really is a great place to do a bigger type of trip. All right, so the three main ways that you would get around in Mexico would be flying, busing, or driving. There isn't really a train system here the way there is in Europe. I think there's a few places where you can train, but in general, training is not going to be a part of your the way that you're going to get around in this country. One thing we're not going to touch on, because this isn't within our experience and probably not something I would recommend in general, is we're not going to talk about hitchhiking. This is just not something we've done in the country, and we'll go through this because Mexico does have a reputation for being a bit unsafe, especially if you are driving. And while in general we think that it is safe, I personally would not choose to hitchhike in Mexico. There's very few countries in the world that I actually probably would feel comfortable with that. So if that's the means that you're going to take, then obviously you make that choice for yourself. But we're going to cover flights, buses, and driving.
All right. Yeah. So starting with flights, I think one of the things that I don't actually know if this was surprising to us. I think one of the things when we first got here that we found really enjoyable, especially about being in Mexico City, was access to flights and kind of ease of going so many places. When we were living in Mexico City, we were traveling kind of every few weeks, checking out somewhere new in Mexico, and being able to do that from Mexico City is great because there's direct flights basically to every mid-size or larger city in the country. And so really took advantage of that. And there are a number of different airlines. Some of them don't have the nicest frills, but they're all pretty solid. And if you kind of know what you're getting into, it's a great relatively easy way to travel around. Mexico's a really big country. And so that plus some of the roads not being the most direct means some of those long trips you take, if you really want to look at flights, because you can save yourself like entire days of travel.
Yeah, for sure. So I think that flights would generally be my recommendation for the longer trips. So say you're planning to go from like Mexico City to Merida and you're like, what is the best way of getting from point A to point B? And, how am I going to make this choice? So I think the first thing that you want to do is sit down and look at like, okay, how long is this adventure? Now, doing a road trip between those two cities, if you've got the time and you want to stop, could be a great option. But I think in general, for most of us, we're going to say, okay, this is going to be a pretty extensive drive. You're going to go through many different places. It's not really going to be doable through like one direct bus or something like that. So a flight is going to be the best option. So usually we would hop on something like Skyscanner, look at all the different options and see what's available. In Mexico, there's a number of different airlines like Ryan mentioned. I think the most common, most popular, most well-known one would be Aeromexico. Aeromexico is the nicest airline in Mexico, but it also is the most expensive one. So that's why we usually hop on Skyscanner just to compare, because there's also a couple of budget airlines, which are Volaris and Viva Aerobus. And so those ones fly a number of different routes throughout Mexico. And then there's a couple of smaller airlines that have kind of more specialized routes. One is TAR Airlines and the other one is Aeromar. So Aeromar is an airline that we flew one time that flew between, I think, Mexico City and Puerto Escondido. I think it does Oaxaca to Puerto Escondido as well. So you don't have to memorize all the airlines. I think just knowing something like Google Flights or Skyscanner is going to be really helpful to start doing that. But when you start mapping out, okay, how long is it going to take me? What's going to be the cost if I have to take a bus from here to here, maybe stay overnight and then take another bus from here to here? It's going to take me 2 days versus like, hey, this is a 1 hour flight that I can get for relatively affordable. You can kind of start making your decision just based on that. And when we first moved to Mexico, like 6 years ago, flights were really, really, really affordable. Like domestic flights were incredibly affordable, which is why we were able to basically take a trip like once a month. We've found that flights have gone up. And one thing you do have to be cautious about is like all the additional add-ons. So you'll look at kind of the base fare on Volaris or Viva Aerobus, and then you go through the whole process. By the time you've purchased seats and maybe add a checked bag and maybe you want to do some sort of upgrade, it can be a bit more expensive. But I would say in general, still, if it's the matter of like 2 days in a bus, taking like a 1 to 2 hour flight is going to be a way better, like just cost benefit for you in terms of travel. So that kind of goes over like the airlines, the different ones to look at. But I would say the biggest thing with airlines is like they are the best option for longer travel because Mexico is, like we've mentioned, a huge country.
Yeah, and kind of like you said, it's good to be aware, like, especially if I was trying to come in and travel on a fairly low budget, of probably wanting to travel with as minimal luggage as possible. Because if you're going to take flights, that's really where you're going to end up paying a lot. The airport taxes, the government of Mexico has raised the airport taxes quite a bit, but those do vary from airport to airport. So, for example, you can look at the new airport in Mexico City, which the government is trying to incentivize people to use, and kind of say like, okay, well, I can, save some money by going there. Another thing is there's often, like, especially in central Mexico, different options between airports. If you're in Mexico City, you could go to Toluca, you could go to the secondary new airport, you could go to Puebla. If you're in, going to San Miguel, you can go to León, you can come to Querétaro. So it's kind of worth looking at different airports too, and you can usually find some deals that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I feel like one of the things that becomes like the most tricky when you're planning a trip in a country like Mexico is when you've got kind of the medium distance places. So we actually just had this with our most recent trip to Puerto Vallarta, where we looked at flying, which I think for most people between Querétaro and Puerto Vallarta, that might seem like a really obvious trip to fly. But it's about 9 hours in a car. Guadalajara is right in the middle. That's a city we really love. So we were like, okay, we could kind of make a trip out of it. And then the benefit of that is that we would have a car in our destination. And there are only direct flights between Querétaro and Puerto Vallarta like a couple times a week, and I don't think they worked exactly with our days. So we were looking at having to fly via Mexico City. So when you start kind of adding up the time of like, hey, we should be at the airport like maybe 2.5 hours early. The airport's 30 minutes from our house. That's 3 hours. Then it's going to be about like 5 hours because we've got a 1 hour flight, a layover in Mexico City, and then another 1 hour flight. You're almost looking at the exact same travel time as driving. And so I feel like these are the kind of destinations where when people are traveling, they're kind of thinking a little bit more about like, do I drive rather than fly? And what are like the cost differences with these like medium distance destinations?
Yeah, I think for us, especially now, like we have a car here, we're always kind of balancing out like, hey, would it just be nicer to drive, not have to do the security stuff, worry about baggage and all of that. But I think our probably like, if something's under like 3 hours, we're definitely looking at taking buses first. Like when we were in Mexico City, if we were going to go to Puebla or Querétaro, San Miguel, Cuernavaca, all of those places. We flew to Guadalajara, but like I think busing, that's a reasonable distance. So I think we're always kind of balancing out like, okay, flying is going to be quicker, but you add all this extra time in. Busing is smoother in some regards. The thing that can be challenging about it, especially like depending on what city you're in, is like, are you going to get there? Is the bus station going to be overall pretty chill? We had like one really bad experience of a like wildly crazy bus station around Christmas time in Mexico City. But overall, like you can show up at a bus station much closer to the time your bus is leaving at. Buses are reasonably reliable in terms of the time they arrive, but we're going to get more into buses.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe let's wrap up airlines and flying a little bit more. So I feel like one thing that if you've never flown in Mexico, you might be wondering like, okay, what is it like when I get to the airport? Are the airports nice? Do they have good facilities? If I have to be there 3 hours early because I'm checking a bag or checking a couple of bags, like, is it going to be a nice experience or would it be better for me to just hop on a bus?
Yeah, it varies a lot from city to city, but in general, the airports aren't like going to blow you away, but are like totally fine, reasonably chill. I think we both find like going through security in Mexico tends to be a bit quicker. Lines tend to be a bit shorter, and it just is overall a little bit more chill than most airports in like the States or Canada. And then, once you're in the airport, like especially the kind of main Mexico City airport, a little bit chaotic, but lots of like food options, stores, that type of stuff. Smaller, more regional airports, like here in Querétaro, we've been to like the Guanajuato airport. Like those are places where it's like, a little bit more bare bones and maybe a smaller airport than you'd think given the size of the city, but still overall pretty chill, easy experience. And even if you didn't speak any Spanish, like there's typically people at the airport who speak English who can help you out and direct you where you need to go. But airports tend to work the same kind of everywhere in the world. So it's pretty easy and straightforward to navigate.
Yeah, for sure. I don't think we've ever had any like terrible experiences at any airport in Mexico. And I think it's also worth mentioning if anyone has like lounge access through a priority pass or a credit card or something, the majority of the airports that we've been to here do have that. And all the lounges seem to be relatively nice. Some are a little bit smaller than others, but in general, that's a nice experience. Even Querétaro, which is quite a small airport, has a little lounge that you can access.
Yeah, one thing I will say that comes to mind for me is I think checking bags in Mexico seems to be like longer lines and more chaotic than other places. I don't know if it's just like it's gotten worse over the years and we've been here and it's actually worse everywhere now, but that's something I would really try to avoid if you can is checking, because often you'll show up at the airport and that's where you're going to spend your most time is like standing in a line to check a bag. And so, yeah, avoid that if you can, or like, pay for a priority so you can get around to the main line, because that's like probably the biggest annoyance that we've found at Mexican airports.
Yeah, for sure. I think that is very true. And one thing that has been, I guess, a little more challenging with traveling with a baby now is that, one, she has a lot more stuff, and two, most airlines actually won't grant you your tickets, even if you're not checking a bag when you have an infant on your lap, you have to go into the check-in counter. So I feel like we've just spent like a lot more time having to wait in these lines and go to the check-in counter. And for me, it's like because everyone's kind of showing up 2.5 hours early, I'm to the point where I'm like, let's just go 3 hours early, because I would much rather like get through the line quickly, get through security, and then go to a lounge or go to a Starbucks or, grab a coffee and chill. Like, to me, it's a lot like I would rather be waiting on the side of where my gate is and just having a coffee and relaxing versus like standing in a line, checking my clock, feeling a little bit stressed. So I feel like that's definitely weighed into a lot of our decisions recently in terms of like, do we fly, do we bus, do we drive, et cetera, because it really does make a huge difference if you need to go to the airport 3 hours in advance. Like, even if you have a 1 hour flight, that makes it like a 4 hour trip versus I feel like a couple of years ago, it was like, you have carry-on, you've got your bag, you can show up like 1 hour early, everything's super chill. Hopefully things will go back to that as travel kind of evens out a little bit kind of post-pandemic. But I feel like our experience over the last 6-ish months has been that airports are really hectic and seem to just have a lot of lines, and you do have to be there quite a bit early.
Yeah. Want to move into busing?
Yeah, for sure. So I think that you kind of touched on it before, but we kind of have, sort of a distance that we kind of look at. And I feel like knowing how long you have to be early for a plane ride, et cetera, plays into it. So when I was chatting with my friend who's planning a trip, she was saying like, oh, I'm looking at flights between Mexico City and Querétaro. And I was like, well, I would just take a bus personally. So just to give you some context on that, it's 2.5 to 3 hours, generally about 3 hours on the bus. You can bus right from the airport or go to one of the bus stations in Mexico City. And then the bus station in Querétaro is super close to the Centro. It's maybe like a 10-minute Uber to the historic Centro, where a lot of hotels and a lot of people would be staying and that type of thing. And so it costs about 450 pesos, which these days is about $20, maybe a little bit more than that, maybe 25 US dollars for a seat. And so when you think about the cost of a plane ticket, which is going to be significantly more than that, especially if you have checked baggage, plus needing to be at the airport a couple hours early, even though the flight is really short, you're basically going to spend about the same amount of time in transit. So yeah, we always kind of take that into consideration and then look at like, okay, so the distance is, I would say probably around 4 hours and less. We're definitely comparing between flights and buses almost always win in that type of distance.
Yeah, and with buses, there's a big range. Like, there's a couple companies that are kind of like the premier long distance bus lines, Primera Plus, ETN, and ADO. And so we've taken all those bus companies and had solid experiences. But there's also a lot more like regional companies. And so you can really pay like as little, you pay for comfort. And so for us, like, we typically look at like a Primera Plus or an ETN, and like you said, that price, like $25 from here to Mexico City, that gets you into one of the buses that have kind of the big seats. There's only 3 per row, so you can sit by yourself if you're solo, and just have a lot more space and a lot more chill, comfortable trip. But you can also find more regional companies that'll do it for a lower price. But yeah, typically as well with the bus lines, whether it's here, especially if you're going to like more like secondary cities in Mexico, those bus stations tend to be a lot closer to the city. So you're looking at flying and it's like, hey, take an Uber out to the airport, be there early, go through the whole security process, deal with your baggage, get on the flight, whatever. Then you're at an airport that's outside another city. You have to take a taxi in, versus often getting in a bus line that you might be able to walk to, or take an easier cab to, and then get to a city. You're like already in the center of the city. So that's one of the big advantages with busing. They tell you to be, I think, an hour early, but
I think it's generally 30 minutes.
Yeah, and you can pretty reliably do that. Busing here, just from our personal experience, I feel like 25% of the time we go, the bus, maybe less than that, maybe like 15% of the time, it's been late, especially if you're not like departing from the city the bus departs from. But overall, relatively reliable, and we haven't had any like crazy late experiences other than one time around Christmas.
Yeah, for sure. That was, I think, kind of an anomaly. Just a lot of people traveling to go see their families outside of Mexico City, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, overall, our experience has been that the bus stations are all relatively nice, relatively chill. I think my experience has been that they don't have like a ton of food options. So I feel like that's one thing to consider. Like airports definitely have more restaurants and food options and stuff like that, but they generally are nice and clean and have, you know, good bathroom facilities and all that type of stuff. And like Ryan mentioned, we've never had a bus that like departed early. That's definitely not Mexican style. So if anything, you know, 30 minutes is plenty of time to be at the bus station. I think one thing for me, especially a couple of years ago when we didn't speak as good as Spanish and we were a little bit more uncertain, is that I worried a little bit more about the bus leaving without us, just because like with flights, it's like on a board, you have a gate. Even if you don't speak Spanish or whatever language it is, you know you're going to like A2, that's where your flight's taking off. You can go, you can kind of like follow the crowd a little bit. And I find with the bus depots, the bus stations, it's like the buses kind of just pull up and you got to really be listening for like your city to be called. And yeah, it's the type of thing that I think if you're not comfortable with the language is a little bit more stressful. But for me, if you're doing something like Mexico City to Querétaro or Querétaro to Puebla or something like that, I just feel like taking a bus is a way better option than taking a flight because it's going to be significantly cheaper. And this is especially if you have checked luggage because the buses don't charge you extra. You get to put your luggage underneath. And you know, for us to like fly between Querétaro and Mexico City, for example, would just be super expensive, especially with taking all the babies' things versus like for the three of us to go, it's about for 3 seats too. It's about 1,200 pesos, which is like $60, 60 USD, something like that for the whole trip. And we can take like her travel crib and her car seat and her stroller and the suitcases that we need. And there's no like problems with that. It's not like, oh, $50 more, et cetera, et cetera. So I do feel like there's a lot of cases where buses are a really great option.
Yeah. And I think, like you said, kind of the example of our friend asking us, bus tends to be the place maybe people overlook as a travel option because we're kind of accustomed to like flying around Canada and America and less so taking like those longer buses. But yeah, can be really nice if you're getting on the right bus line. Primera Plus, ETN, I believe ADO does as well, have online booking. So you can go online, compare the times. You don't need to go to the bus station in advance to buy the ticket. You can buy it online and go from there. But yeah, buses are really solid. We use them quite a bit, but do tend to find like once you get to like a 7-hour bus ride or like that type, maybe probably over 5 hours on a bus, often you can find like with one of like a Vivo Aerobus, a Volaris, one of these regional airlines, a plane ticket that's like comparable price and is going to save you like 5 hours. So we haven't done many of those long trips in Mexico, although we do know some people who have. But yeah, bus overall in Mexico, very solid and reliable way of getting around the country.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just an example that I'll give of, you know, a situation where I would definitely look at flying over busing is like Oaxaca City to the coast, like Puerto Escondido or Mazunte, something like that. It doesn't look very far on a map. It looks like it'd be quite close. You'd think like, oh yeah, we'll just pop on over this mountain range and we'll be at the beach. But the road isn't very good there. It's super windy. It's through the mountains. There's like big trucks going, people passing. So it's a bit dangerous. And it just takes a long time because it's like an older mountain road. So something that you can do with like Aeromar or probably some of the other airlines that'll maybe take you probably even less than an hour of actual flight time takes you about 7 or 8 hours in a car. And we've had a few friends who have done that are like, it's horrible. I was car sick. You know, it's just not a very pleasant ride. So definitely worth doing like a little research on things like that, because I feel like to me, that is like an obvious, like I would fly in that case, unless you're very, very strapped with a very tight budget. I think that that's a really great choice for choosing a flight over a bus. And then, you know, versus I use that other example of like Mexico City to Querétaro, to me is like a very obvious choice for taking a bus or a car, just because that's going to be a lot simpler, a lot more affordable, a lot quicker.
Yeah. And so that kind of takes us into like another chunk of options, which are mostly like car options. So like if you're doing a round trip somewhere, renting a car, hiring a private driver, even looking at taking like a long distance Uber. And also there's a kind of car sharing service that's quite common for people to use in Mexico called BlaBlaCar. We've had some friends use it as well. So let's start maybe with rental cars. One thing we found, we've rented a couple cars in Mexico. There's always like a bit of shenanigans going on with rental cars. I think everywhere in the world, there's some like sketchy businesses, but we've had in Mexico it being a little bit challenging sometimes with, oh, there's this fee, there's this thing, we don't have cars. So we found typically like there's maybe like a smaller, more local company that is reliable in a city, and some of these big companies, like they're doing stuff like you make a reservation, they say they don't have a car, there's extra fees. And the other thing with rental cars is often the charge for drop off. So if you're driving from one place to another and leaving the car, is quite a bit more than it is in the States. That said, we've taken a number of trips where we're going maybe a couple hours out, coming back to the same city. We've used rental cars and had a good experience.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting. I feel like in most cases with this type of stuff, especially in a foreign country where maybe you don't speak the language, I would recommend like go with the bigger, more national brands, like the ones that you're familiar with from maybe the US or Canada. But it's so interesting because we've had like the most problems, for example, with Alamos rental car. I would absolutely not recommend renting with Alamos rental car. I feel like we've just had problems with them every time. They've hassled us. They've told us it's more expensive than what we booked. They've tried to add on a bunch of things. We've had to contact like head offices. One time we didn't even get a car. Just, stressful stuff. And so one thing, if you are going to rent a car, I would go on Facebook, find some local Facebook groups, see if anyone's recommending a company. Like, for example, when we were in the Yucatan based in Merida, we had a friend recommend a smaller company called Veloz. We rented a car like a number of weekends while we were there. We never had any problems with them. They were always really great, good quality cars, et cetera, et cetera. And then also, if you can't find that or you're not comfortable with that, or maybe it doesn't exist, I think actually booking from the website. So we've had the most problems when we've done things like Priceline, Expedia. And I know those are tempting because they give you the best rates. But the thing is that the companies don't want to rent to you. So you show up, you've got a reservation. You think, I have a reservation, give me my car. Oh, no, sorry, we don't have a car. And then they try to give you a higher rate. And so we found that if we can't find those smaller companies, then we'll go directly to the website. Like we'll go budget.com. We'll book right from there.
National a couple times and it's been solid.
Yeah, National's been a good one. I think Budget has been good as well. Alamos has always been horrible, so definitely not them. So smaller companies and then booking directly from the website. If you know a travel agent or somebody who has like a reputation who can kind of do this stuff for you, that can be helpful. Then one other thing with rental cars here is that Mexican companies or Mexico in general just requires that you have their insurance. So even if you're covered like through an American Express card or you have your own insurance from your home country, they're going to make you pay insurance when you get there. So my advice is do like the basic stuff online. And then when you get there, just know that they're going to add a cost for insurance per day. So just budget that into how much you are able to pay and stuff like that. But in terms of driving, and I feel like this goes for busing too, because I know this is one thing that my friend said to me. She was like, well, I don't really want to like be in a bus because there's like a risk of things happening on the road, cartel violence, et cetera, et cetera. In general, we found bus travel to be quite safe. We've never had any issues with buses, and in general, buses are not generally targeted by crime. So busing is pretty safe for the majority of the country. Obviously, there's areas that you should be cautious about and just do a little bit of research on that. With driving, though, you do have to be a little bit more cautious. You do want to make sure if you're driving from one place to another, you do some research online, make sure you know which roads to take. We always advise taking toll roads, even though they're a little more expensive. You'll find that on all blog posts and all Facebook groups, always take the toll roads here. But just do a little bit more research. I feel like it's not the type of country where you just hop in your car and go, and you need to plan out a little bit more with gas stations and where you're going to stop for snacks or food, just because the roadside facilities aren't the same as like maybe we're used to if we come from places like Canada and the US.
Yeah, I think kind of the way I think about it is with buses, like there are some safety concerns involved in taking a bus. Like they're on the highway. And sometimes buses get into crashes. So it's worth like considering for you. And I think flying probably is like the safest option out of all the options. We don't kind of view the risks, especially like if you're going day, you're not taking a long overnight bus route, to be busing to be, it's overall very safe. Driving, being in a rental car, being in your own car exposes you to a couple risks that you don't have in the bus. One is kind of like highway bandit types, and the other is police corruption. And so I think especially for us, like there's places where we would probably think twice about having, renting and driving ourselves, or maybe it would give us more a pause, and that might be like closer to the US border. If we were like in and around Cancun, like I know that's a place you hear often people saying like, hey, there's more corrupt cops. That said, we've rented a car in Cancun, driven it to Tulum, and had nothing but a good time in that area. We've driven all over the Yucatan, and lots of other places. So in general, it's just stuff you need to be kind of mindful of, because that they do exist. But I think for us and like almost everyone we talk to, the like calibration needs to be from, most people are kind of really afraid, really worried about it. And there should be some like, concern and thought put into it. But most people are like too far on that side of the spectrum. And it is actually like a pleasant way to get around.
Yeah, we've had really good experiences driving around Mexico. And one of the things that I really love about driving around Mexico is that you do have the freedom to stop when you want and create your own itinerary and get to a little bit more like off the beaten path places that might be hard to get to. You might have to take like a bus and then a colectivo and then an Uber, et cetera, versus driving. You get to really, see the countryside, see the landscape, kind of get to know the country in a different way. And there are a lot of remote places in Mexico that are hard to get to if you don't have a car, and they take a long time. So it might not be the best option via tour or driver, et cetera, et cetera. Like, for example, there's a waterfall region in San Luis Potosi. And then there's also, some hot springs that are kind of in the Hidalgo region outside of Mexico City. Those places are challenging to get to. And one of the best ways to go see them is to have a car, because then you can kind of explore at your own leisure and pace, et cetera, et cetera. One other thing about driving that I just want to add, and I actually feel like this is probably like realistically like the biggest concern or safety concern that people should have, especially if you're not from this area. And maybe if you are like us from a country like Canada, where driving laws and driving rules and regulations to actually get certified to drive, et cetera, are very different, is that there's a lot of chaos here. There's a lot of, things happening on the road that feel a little hectic to us. So driving in big cities can be quite overwhelming and a little scary. And, driving on the highway, you kind of got to figure out how their culture is. And there's things that are different about that. And so I think realistically, that's the biggest safety concern I have with driving. And while I think it's important to be cautious and do your research and make sure you're traveling on safe roads and good regions, I think that knowing that it's different from other countries is like the biggest thing, and you kind of have to adapt, and it is chaotic.
Yeah, but it has been awesome, I think, for us, those trips where we rented cars, been able to get out, explore more, see more stuff. And so, yeah, big fan of renting a car, driving around. The other thing that I think most people maybe overlook in Mexico is kind of access and affordability of a private driver can sometimes be like really good. And so like you might be able to find, if you've got a couple friends traveling with you, just someone who can drive you to a different place and make it pretty affordable. We've typically found these kind of through connections, through friends. Sometimes if you're taking Uber in a city, you might be able to like start a conversation with the driver. The driver might even offer his services. And then another great place is Facebook groups, where we've been connected with drivers who, can take you from one city to another, can take you on a tour, that type of thing.
Yeah, for sure. I think Facebook groups, like expat groups or whatever for the city you're looking for, is super key. That's where I found the drivers here. We have a couple connections to drivers that they can do, airport transfers, which will be a little more reliable and about the same price as taking an Uber. They can drive to and from Mexico City. I know we have friends that just hired a driver to go to and from San Miguel de Allende, which is about an hour from Querétaro, going to places like the León Airport or Guanajuato, Mexico City, For us, at least in our area, those are great options for hiring a driver. The prices for hiring a driver are going to be more expensive than, likely renting a car. Definitely having your own car. It's cheaper to just drive that if you can. Definitely more expensive than a bus, but I think the benefit of that is that somebody comes and picks you up where you're staying at your house, takes you to your destination. You don't have to do Ubers back and forth from bus stations. It's a little bit more simple, straightforward, a little bit faster. You have the option to stop along the way if you want. So I think that this is definitely something that, like Ryan said, I think people overlook because they think private driver, that's for, millionaires, billionaires. I'm not somebody who hires a private driver, especially if you live somewhere like New York, LA. It's just going to be insanely expensive to have that. But here in Mexico, it's actually a really feasible option. And one thing that we just found out from our friends here who actually have a pet is that the bus companies here don't allow animals on them unless you want to put your animal down below. And they have like a small cabin-sized dog. And so for them, hiring a private driver is actually the best option. And hiring a driver for distances like outside of a city or, et cetera, are going to be a better option than trying to depend on Uber, which might not want to take you or might rack up cost really, really quickly, or they might cancel on you, et cetera, et cetera. So definitely something to consider.
Yeah, and kind of just one final thing, like for people, especially if you're on like a tighter budget, like people we know who are on tighter budgets have used car sharing services. Not something we've had experience with, so can't really speak a ton about. I think BlaBlaCar is like the most popular one. And there's people who kind of do this a little bit more as a business, and you might find like, hey, a Colectivo. But that and then busing are kind of the low budget options if you're taking a longer trip, more backpacker style. If you've got more of a flexible budget, that really opens things up. And then you can start kind of comparing flights, those like bigger, more national bus lines that have like first class buses, private drivers, even renting cars. But kind of overall, one of the things I think that we like to get across to people is so many cool cities, like big cities, mid-sized cities, small towns in Mexico, and kind of getting out and exploring them is an awesome thing to do. And so if you're going on a trip to a city, try to find like some of those places that are nearby and get out on an adventure and, take a bus there or a Colectivo or rent a car and go explore.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this kind of wraps up everything we wanted to share today. I'm sure there's more details we could go into, but those will be more trip specific. So if anyone has any follow-up questions or is planning a trip to Mexico and is kind of curious about more details on this type of stuff, feel free to reach out, info@theworldwanders.com. Otherwise, we hope this has been helpful and insightful. And, obviously things are different country to country, but you can kind of apply probably these same sorts of principles in terms of how to find information and considering different options to any country in the world, really. But hopefully you enjoy, and thanks so much for listening.
Thanks for listening to this episode. If you want more, make sure to check out The World Wanders Insider, available on Patreon at patreon.com/theworldwanderers.
For show notes, head over to theworldwanders.com. Find us on social media at The World Wanderers Podcast and join the private Facebook community at World Wanders, a community for travelers.
You can always get in touch with us at info@theworldwanderers.com. And if you enjoyed the show, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. It really helps us find new listeners.
See you next time.